It was January 1945. The canvas tent flap lifted, and Annalisa Hoffman stepped through into a world that made no sense. She kept her eyes down, waiting for the shove between her shoulder blades that always came, waiting for the bark of commands, waiting for hands to grab and search and strip away whatever dignity she had left. But none of that happened. Before we dive deeper, every day we make videos like this, so be sure to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Back to the story. The British soldier who'd escorted her simply stepped aside, and when she risked the smallest glance upward, she saw him nod once before turning to leave. Not a word, not a threat, just silence. And somehow that silence felt more terrifying than any shout could have been. She stood frozen just inside the entrance, her worn boots still caked with the mud from 3 days of walking, her hands hanging at her sides because she didn't know what else to do with them. The space around her was warm, impossibly warm after weeks of cold that had settled into her bones like a second skeleton. And there were voices somewhere deeper in the tent, low and steady. The kind of voices people use when they're talking about ordinary things, like tea or the weather. Annalisa's breath caught in her chest and stayed there. This was wrong. This was all wrong. She was a prisoner, a German woman captured in the final chaotic weeks of a war everyone knew was ending. And prisoners didn't get warmth or quiet voices or anything resembling peace. They got what they deserved, or what the victors decided they deserved, which was usually the same thing, son. She'd learnt that lesson months ago when the first camp fell and the guards scattered and the roads filled with people who'd forgotten how to be anything but afraid. She'd learned to make herself small, to move through spaces like smoke, to never draw attention because attention meant danger, and danger meant you didn't see tomorrow. So when the woman in the British nurse's uniform approached her with a blanket folded over one arm, Annalisa's entire body locked up. Every muscle seized, her jaw clamped shut so hard her teeth ached, and the scream that wanted to climb up her throat got stuck somewhere behind her breastbone, where it burned and burned but couldn't escape. The nurse stopped a few feet away, close enough that Annalise could see the tiredness around her eyes, but not so close that it felt like an invasion. She said something in English, her voice soft, almost apologetic, and when Annalisa didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even blink, the nurse simply draped the blanket over a nearby chair and stepped back. Not over Annalisa's shoulders, not forced into her hands, just placed nearby, an offering, a choice. Annalisa stared at that blanket like it might bite her. For 3 years, she'd been running or hiding or surviving in the spaces between orders and cruelty, and in all that time, she'd learned the rules. You obeyed fast, or you paid for it. You kept your head down and your mouth shut unless someone demanded words from you. And even then, you measured each syllable because the wrong word could be the last word. You didn't expect mercy, because mercy was a luxury from a world that had burned away in 1939 and left only ash and teeth behind. Authority meant fear. Uniforms meant pain. Kindness was the bait before the trap. These were facts, solid as stones, and Annalisa had built her survival on them. But here in this British medical tent, somewhere in the shattered countryside of northern Germany, those facts were crumbling, and she didn't have anything to replace them with. The nurse gestured toward a row of cots along the far wall, each one made up with sheets that looked almost clean, and said something else that Annalisa's brain couldn't process because it was still stuck on the blanket, on the lack of shouting, on the impossible wrongness of being treated like a person instead of a problem. Another nurse appeared, this one older, with grey streaks in her hair pulled back under her cap, and she carried a tin cup that steamed in the cool air. She set it on a small table beside the chair with the blanket and stepped back just like the first one had, maintaining that careful distance that Annalisa couldn't understand. They were waiting for something from her, some response or acknowledgement, but her throat had closed up entirely, and her tongue felt like a stone in her mouth. She tried to swallow and couldn't. Tried to nod, and her neck wouldn't cooperate. So she just stood there, shaking so slightly it was almost invisible, while these 2 British women watched her with expressions that held no anger, no disgust, no contempt. Just patience. Just a kind of quiet waiting that felt more dangerous than any weapon. The days that followed broke something in Annalisa that hadn't been broken by the war itself, by the hunger, or the cold, or the endless grey march of fear. On that first day, they led her to a cot, and she sat, because her legs were about to give out anyway, and someone brought her soup in a proper bowl with a spoon and set it on the table beside her without demanding anything in return. She stared at that soup until it went cold, unable to make her hand reach for it because her mind kept screaming that this was a test, that the moment she took something they offered would be the moment they revealed the true cost. But no one came to collect payment. No one demanded labor or information or humiliation. They just let her sit there with her cold soup until eventually a different nurse came and took it away without comment and brought her a piece of bread instead, dark and dense, real bread, and left it wrapped in cloth on the table. Annalisa waited until the tent was dim with evening, and most of the nurses had moved to other sections before she finally took that bread and ate it in tiny bites that she barely tasted because she was crying without sound, tears just sliding down her face while she chewed and swallowed and tried not to fall apart. That night, she lay on the cot under a blanket that smelled like soap and stared at the canvas ceiling and felt her mind trying to make sense of something it had no framework for. The British were supposed to be the enemy, not her enemy perhaps, not in any personal way, but the enemy of Germany, of the regime that had sent men like her husband to die in Russia and had turned her city into rubble and had made the last years of her life into a grey blur of survival. She'd expected hatred. She'd expected to be punished for being German, for being on the wrong side of history, for existing in the shape of the country that had brought so much death to the world. Instead, they'd given her soup and bread and a warm place to sleep, and the disconnect between expectation and reality was so vast that she couldn't cross it. Her mind simply stopped trying. When the doctor came the next morning, a thin man with spectacles who introduced himself in careful, slow English and then tried again in halting German, Annalisa looked at him but couldn't make words happen. He asked her name, and she opened her mouth but nothing emerged except a small sound like air escaping. He didn't push. He just nodded, like this was perfectly normal, and said in his broken German that it was all right. She could answer when she was ready. They just wanted to make sure she was healthy. Was she in pain anywhere? Did she need anything? That last question, did she need anything, circled in her head for hours afterward. What kind of captor asked their prisoner what they needed? What kind of enemy cared about pain? The doctor examined her gently, explaining each movement before he made it, asking permission with his eyes, even when she couldn't verbally respond. And when he was finished, he told her she was malnourished and exhausted, but nothing was broken, nothing that wouldn't heal with time and rest. Rest. As if she were a person who deserved rest. As if she weren't a prisoner. As if the war hadn't made her into something less than human. She watched him leave and felt that burning in her chest intensify, that trapped scream growing bigger and hotter until she thought it might consume her from the inside. Days passed in this strange suspension of reality. Annalisa moved through the medical tent like a ghost, watching other prisoners arrive, watching the British nurses and doctors treat each one with the same careful gentleness they'd shown her. She saw an older woman break down sobbing when someone brought her tea, saw a young girl flinch away from kindness before finally accepting it, saw men with hollow eyes sit at the long table in the center of the tent and eat hot food while British soldiers stood guard nearby without menace, without violence, just present in case they were needed. None of it made sense. All of it made the silence inside Annalisa grow stronger, deeper, more complete. The nurses learned to work around her wordlessness. They'd gesture, and she'd nod or shake her head, and they seemed content with that minimal communication, never pushing for more. One of them, a young woman named Margaret, who couldn't have been more than 25, started sitting near Annalisa's cot in the evenings and talking in a soft voice about nothing important. She'd describe the weather, mention a letter from home, comment on how the war was truly ending now, how soon they'd all be able to go home. Annalisa would listen without looking at her directly, absorbing the sound of that voice the way dry earth absorbs rain, desperate for it, but unable to show the desperation. Margaret never seemed to expect responses. She'd just talk for a while, then pat Annalisa's shoulder with a feather-light touch before moving on to other patients. And each time that touch happened, Annalisa would have to fight the urge to either flinch away or grab Margaret's hand and hold on and never let go. Both responses felt equally dangerous. On the fourth day, or maybe it was the fifth, because time had become fluid and strange, Margaret brought Annalisa a cup of tea and sat down on the chair beside the cot and said in her gentle English that Annalisa probably couldn't understand most of, but could feel the meaning of. That she knew this must all be very confusing and frightening, being captured and not knowing what would happen next. but that she wanted Annalisa to know she was safe here, that no one would hurt her, that the war was over for her now, and that was a good thing, wasn't it? To be done with war. And something in the way Margaret said those words, in the absolute sincerity of her tone, in the way she looked at Annalise like she was a person worthy of sincerity, finally cracked through the wall that had been holding Annalisa together. She didn't break down. She didn't sob or wail or collapse into Margaret's arms. That wasn't how it happened. Instead, her mouth opened, and a single word came out, rough and small, and scraped raw from disuse. And the word was danke. Thank you. Barely a whisper, barely audible even in the quiet of the tent. But it was sound. It was speech. It was the first word she'd managed to produce in days. Margaret's face transformed. She smiled, not with triumph or satisfaction, but with simple warmth. And she took Annalisa's hand in both of hers and squeezed gently and said something in English that sounded like "you're welcome," or maybe "it's all right," or maybe just "yes." And Annalisa felt the tears come then, silent and steady, sliding down her face while she sat there holding hands with this British nurse who had no reason to be kind to her, except that apparently kindness didn't need a reason. The crying lasted a long time. Margaret stayed the whole while, just sitting there, holding Annalisa's hand, occasionally reaching up to brush tears away from Annalisa's cheeks with her thumb, not saying anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. When it finally subsided, when Annalisa could breathe again without hitching, Margaret brought her a clean cloth to dry her face and another cup of tea and sat with her while she drank it, and this time when she talked about small things, about weather and letters and hope for the future, Annalisa looked at her directly and listened with her full attention instead of from behind the wall of her fear. Speaking that first word didn't open the floodgates. Annalisa's voice came back slowly, cautiously, like an animal that had been beaten and needed to relearn trust. She'd answer direct questions with single words at first, ja or nein, and sometimes a whispered sentence when the doctors asked about her health or the nurses asked if she needed anything. But she couldn't have full conversations yet, couldn't string thoughts together into explanations or stories or anything resembling normal human interaction. The silence had been her armor for too long, and she couldn't remove it all at once without feeling naked and vulnerable to attack. But she was trying. She'd force words out even when they felt like stones in her throat, even when her body screamed at her to stay quiet and stay safe. Because these British soldiers and nurses and doctors weren't attacking her. They weren't punishing her for being German or for surviving when so many hadn't. They were just taking care of her, day after day, with a patience and kindness that she'd thought had died with the old world. One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, the doctor with the spectacles, whose name she'd learned was Dr. Patterson, sat down across from her with a clipboard and said in his careful German that he needed to ask her some questions for the official records. Just basic information, nothing difficult. He needed to know her full name, where she was from, whether she had family, that sort of thing. Annalisa took a breath and started to answer, and as she spoke, haltingly but clearly, giving him the facts of her life, she realized that this was the first time since the war began that anyone in authority had asked about her as if she were a person with a history rather than just a body taking up space. Dr. Patterson wrote down everything she said without judgment, nodding occasionally, asking gentle follow-up questions when he needed clarification. When he asked about family and she told him her husband had died at Stalingrad 3 years ago, and she had no children and her parents were gone and her sister might still be alive in Hamburg, but she didn't know, he paused and looked up from his clipboard and said in English first and then in German, "I'm very sorry," and the sorrow in his voice sounded real, not performative, not polite, just genuinely sad that she'd lost so much. That night, Annalisa lay in her cot thinking about Dr. Patterson's sorrow and Margaret's kindness and the way the British soldiers who patrolled the camp did so without aggression, without the swagger of conquerors. She thought about the food they were given, simple but sufficient and served without resentment. She thought about the medical care freely provided, the infections treated, the wounds dressed, the illnesses tended. She thought about being spoken to in her own language when possible, about having her name used instead of being called you or prisoner or nothing at all. She thought about how wrong she'd been about what capture would mean, how every expectation had been built on fear, and every fear had turned out to be unfounded. And she understood then, in a way she hadn't quite grasped before, that the silence that had gripped her wasn't about losing her voice. It was about her mind protecting her from kindness, because kindness from the enemy was more psychologically devastating than cruelty would have been. Cruelty she understood. Cruelty fit into the world as she'd learned to navigate it. But kindness required her to acknowledge that maybe the British weren't monsters, which meant maybe the things she'd been told about them were lies, which meant maybe other things she'd been told were lies too. And once you started pulling that thread, the entire fabric of reality began to unravel. Her silence had been her mind's desperate attempt to hold reality together by refusing to process what was happening. If she didn't speak, if she didn't engage, if she didn't accept the kindness, then maybe she wouldn't have to face what the kindness meant. But she couldn't maintain that silence forever. The human need for connection, for communication, for acknowledgement was too strong. And these people who were caring for her were making it safe to break that silence, safe to speak again, safe to be vulnerable enough to accept help from former enemies. Over the following weeks, Annalisa slowly returned to something resembling herself, or perhaps became a new version of herself, someone who'd been broken down and rebuilt with different materials. She talked more, participated in the daily routines of the medical camp, helped where she could with simple tasks that made her feel useful instead of just a burden. She learned a few words of English from Margaret, who seemed delighted by her students' progress and would practice with her every evening. She learned the names of the other nurses and doctors, learned their routines and personalities, learned to see them as individuals rather than as a monolithic threatening force. She made friends among the other German prisoners, women mostly, who were all processing this strange captivity in their own ways. Some were suspicious, waiting for the trap to spring. Some were openly grateful. Some were still too shell-shocked to feel anything at all. Annalisa found herself somewhere in the middle, grateful but bewildered, accepting but unable to quite believe this was real. One day, Margaret asked her, in a mix of German and English and hand gestures, why she hadn't spoken for those first days, whether she'd been injured or in shock or just too frightened. Annalisa tried to explain, but the explanation was complicated and her English wasn't good enough and her German felt inadequate for capturing the psychological knot she'd been trapped in. Finally, she just said, in slow, careful English, because she wanted Margaret to understand fully, "You were kind. I did not expect kind. Kind was dangerous." Margaret's face showed confusion for a moment, then understanding, then deep sadness. She took Annalisa's hand again the way she had that first time and said, "Kind is not dangerous. Kind is kind." And Annalisa wanted to believe that, but she wasn't sure she ever fully could, because she'd lived too long in a world where kindness was a weapon or a weakness, and safety only came from silence and invisibility. The war ended officially while Annalisa was still in the British medical camp. The announcement came through, and there was subdued celebration among the British staff, but mostly just exhausted relief. For the German prisoners, it was more complicated. The war was over, which meant the dying would stop, but it also meant facing what came next, facing a destroyed country and an uncertain future and the weight of collective guilt for what had been done in their name, even if they hadn't personally done it. Annalisa felt numb about the news. The war had been over for her the moment she'd been captured, or maybe even before that, the moment she'd decided to stop running and just wait for whatever came next. The official end changed nothing about her daily reality. She was still a prisoner, still dependent on British mercy, still trying to figure out who she was supposed to be now that the structures she'd defined herself against were gone. Dr. Patterson told her that arrangements were being made for repatriation, that eventually she and the others would be sent back to Germany, to whatever was left of their homes, or to relocation camps if their homes were gone entirely. He asked her where she wanted to go, and she didn't have an answer, because the city she'd fled from was mostly rubble, and her sister in Hamburg was probably dead or displaced, and she had no one waiting for her anywhere. She told him this, and he nodded and made notes on his clipboard and said they'd figure it out, not to worry. They'd make sure she ended up somewhere safe. Somewhere safe. As if anywhere could be safe after what the world had just been through. But his confidence was comforting even if she didn't share it. On Annalisa's last day in the camp, Margaret found her packing the few belongings she'd accumulated, mostly clothes donated by the British, or scavenged from relief supplies. Margaret had tears in her eyes, Dr. Patterson's sorrow, and the British soldiers who'd guarded them without cruelty, and the hot soup, and the warm blankets, and the dignity she'd been given when she'd expected nothing but punishment. She turned to the woman and said, her voice steady now, stronger than it had been in years, "I don't know what happens next, but I know that people can surprise you. I know that kindness still exists even after everything that's happened. I know that sometimes the most shocking thing isn't violence or cruelty, sometimes it's care. And if that can exist, if that can survive what we just lived through, then maybe we can too." The woman looked at her with hollow eyes and didn't say anything. And Annalisa didn't blame her because she knew that kind of hope was hard to hold on to when you'd seen what they'd all seen. But Annalisa held on to it anyway, clutching it like a lifeline, because a British nurse had taught her that kind wasn't dangerous, kind was kind, and that lesson had broken through the silence that had trapped her and given her something to build a future on. The truck rolled on through the scarred landscape of a continent trying to heal from wounds that went deeper than anyone could measure. Carrying women who'd forgotten how to dream toward an uncertain future in a broken homeland. And Annalisa, who'd been silent for days because kindness had shocked her more than cruelty ever could, sat among them and held on to Margaret's address in her pocket and decided that she would write that letter, and she hugged Annalise tightly. And Annalisa hugged her back and felt her own tears starting, because this young British woman had given her back the ability to trust kindness, and that was a gift so profound she had no way to properly thank her for it. They didn't share much language, but they didn't need it. Margaret pressed something into Annalisa's hand, a small piece of paper with an address written on it in neat handwriting, and said in English, "Write to me, please. Let me know you are all right." Annalisa nodded and tucked the paper carefully into her pocket and said in her improving English, "I will. Thank you. For everything. For being kind when kind was frightening." Margaret laughed and cried at the same time and hugged her again. And then it was time to go. Annalisa climbed into the back of the truck with 24 other women who'd been cleared for repatriation. And as they drove away from the camp, she looked back and saw Margaret standing there waving, and she waved back until the camp disappeared around a bend in the road. The woman sitting next to her in the truck, someone Annalisa had spoken to only a few times, asked her what she thought would happen next, where they were going, what Germany would be like now. Annalise thought about that question, about the unknown future waiting for them, about the destroyed country they were returning to, about the guilt and grief and reconstruction that lay ahead. And then she thought about Margaret's kindness, and maintain that connection would honor the gift of unexpected care by refusing to let bitterness and fear have the last word. She didn't know if she'd ever fully trust the world again. She didn't know if the wounds would ever completely heal, but she knew she could speak now, could use her voice again, could reach out across the wreckage and connect with other humans who still remembered how to be gentle. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. There are many more real accounts like this. Don't miss the next one.